Marnin!
Madman!
Welcome to the India Explained podcast, recorded in London and San Francisco. One take, unscripted, no rehearsal. Hey, Bunty. Uh, welcome back to our listeners. Bunty, you live in London. London's an old city, and like many old cities, or like many cities generally, I'm assuming it has it's got a bunch of pigeons, right? I have a memory of seeing lots and lots of pigeons in
Correct, 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 correct.
Trafalgar
No, that's true.
Square and so on the last time I was
Yes.
there. Bombay also has a lot of pigeons, by the way. I don't know where I'm going with this, but it was just a kind of crude segue, not a very elegant, segue into a story I want to talk about, which I sent you a link to. So this is Tamil Nadu bus conductor faces
Yeah.
action as pigeon travels ticketless. So this is from, it's on the TOI, but it's from something called TNN, which is, I don't know if it's like Tamil Nadu State News Network or something. Highlights. Conductor with the State Transport Corporation was issued a memo for not issuing a ticket to a pigeon. Inspector quoted a rule purportedly mandating tickets for animals and birds on the bus as well. Now, um, and it just story gets more and more freaking bizarre. I mean, pardon my French. A conductor with the Tamil Nadu State Transport Corporation was issued a memo for letting a pigeon perched on the window of a bus travel without a ticket earlier this week. The pigeon in question was reportedly keeping a drunk passenger company from its perch in a window of the bus.
Okay.
So then the bus went through a remote tribal village. It reached the outskirts of Harur. Transport department inspectors flagged the bus. Okay. And then he said the drunk passenger in his mid 40s at the time had caught hold of the pigeon and was having a conversation with it. Having a conversation is in quotes. So, I don't know this. I think this is what happens that if you transport, my sense is that if you transport animals on
Yeah.
the bus, right,
Yeah. Yeah.
then you have to pay for them, which makes sense because if you've got, like a little, I don't know, little bit,
Cattle, like, yeah, you've
yeah,
got a goat or a,
something, a little baby langur in a cage, you'll keep him next to you or something like that, right?
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah, yeah,
now I don't know that why. So I think this guy was smashed out of his head, out of his
yeah,
mind. He
yeah.
had gripped this pigeon, was assaulting it in some ways. He was having a conversation with it, and that was interpreted as him owning the pigeon and not having paid for it. That's my sense. But
My two pennies worth on this story is how drunk do you have to have a conversation with a pigeon, right? So I'm just thinking in a scale of getting drunk, right, where
yeah.
you fall down, right? You swear at people, or you generally get very happy.
Hmm.
This is next level shit when you catch hold of something that's designed to fly,
Yeah, yeah, perverted. I
and
mean,
yeah, and realize that you're having a conversation. So this guy was completely smashed, right?
yeah.
Now, I think so. The fact that he was so drunk, he didn't even know it was a pigeon, probably, right?
Hmm,
So,
hmm,
and the conductor probably were in trying to maintain the peace and quiet of the bus and the quality of the journey
hmm,
didn't make that into an issue. When the state inspectors got in, right?
hmm, hmm, hmm,
I think what happened, we weren't there, but reading through the story, I'm thinking there was probably an altercation between the inspector and the conductor. This is a
hmm,
conjecture, right? Because if the inspector was a matey fellow with the conductor,
hmm,
he wouldn't have picked up on basically a line item in a bylaw
hmm,
that asks people to. So basically, the probably I think what has happened is the conductor gave a bit of attitude. "Tu kya
hmm,
kar lega?"
hmm,
So and then the inspector and Indian public life is full of these moments where
hmm,
if you show a bit of attitude, right,
hmm,
bureaucracy takes it upon itself to put you in the wrong, right?
hmm,
It
hmm,
happens everywhere, in police stations, in
hmm,
banks, in
hmm,
post office. Like if you try and go against the mood music,
hmm,
right,
hmm,
the system will connive to kind of put you on the back foot. Like,
hmm,
if you go to a police office and say, "Why aren't you writing my report?"
hmm,
"Tu kya kar lega?"
hmm,
Then they'll start, there's no report to write. He'll
hmm,
create nuisance value.
hmm,
I think that's what happened. This inspector created nuisance value because he probably did an uncalled for. So I think the pigeon is the tip of the iceberg. I
hmm,
think there was something else that the conductor was doing which is wrong.
hmm,
All of this is conjecture, by the way, Rohit, because I'm trying to see myself in a bus as a co-passenger of a guy who's talking to a pigeon drunk, right?
hmm.
And I think I'm struggling to find anything coherent. So I'm thinking that, if you try and take that and say that, okay, now let's do a
Yeah.
360 and see what happened. The
Ah.
bus stops, this guy's clinging onto the pigeon. what would get an inspector to trigger a clause as
Mm,
random as this, like the
mm,
carriage of animals? And is
mhm,
it the carriage of one animal? Is it the carriage of group? Like, I know people
mm.
sometimes in rural areas transport chicken and ducks in like in a circular kind of
Mm,
woven basket with
mm.
a netted covering, and that rightly attracts a fee.
Right.
um, but I'm at a loss. I just
Well,
don't know what the good
yeah.
people of Tamil Nadu would make of this.
So this is, I think, just one of those things where, it's just it's just sort of bizarre and absurd, as you point out. But where it leads me to is, I think that there's a whole series of these kind of like stories of human-animal interaction, which in the Indian context, which is, whether you don't have animal control, you don't have the same kinds of rules, regulations, the relationships take very interesting and peculiar forms. Now, in the US, for instance, when we moved into this house, for initially the first summer, there were a couple of raccoons who I think were coming and uprooting our flowers. So, I called a couple of like animal non-profits and all, and I got a lot of information telling us what we could do, saying, it's illegal to do X, Y, Z. This is what you can do. This is what you can't do. So in India, that doesn't happen. So maybe, just I'll just share another story very quickly.
Right,
This is a story that came from a friend of mine who, a college friend of mine, and he got it from someone in the neighborhood where he lived. And this
right,
person he knew was someone who worked I think he worked as a purser or a steward in Jet Airlines or something.
right.
And the story he gave me is that so this guy who was getting on the flight, he was on his I think just before the flight was about to take off, he was just going and doing a basic check, and he was also having a smoke.
Right.
And one of the guys, he was sharing a cigarette. He was having a smoke, and one of the dudes he was having a smoke with was one of the chaps working for the airline who just organizes the luggage, right? Like all the luggage that's come in, just makes sure that it's in the plane's hold. Now, what had happened is that there was someone flying on this plane who I think he was going to from Bombay to Dubai or something, who must have had a pedigreed dog. So there was
Right.
this cage, and when an animal is put on a flight, you have these cages, right, so that the dog can breathe and so on.
Yeah.
So this dog was in the cage or whatever, and this chap who was having a cigarette, not the purser, the other guy, the sort of loader, let's just call him the loader. The loader was
Yeah.
holding him and taking a puff and chatting. Now the dog was a little snippy, so the dog, I think,
Right.
went for this guy's hand and it dropped. The cage dropped,
Right.
and when the cage dropped, the door opened, and this dog just took off on the freeway,
Right.
or whatever, on the runway.
Yeah.
So this is kind of a calamity. So they didn't know what to do. So the guy said, never mind. So this loader told him, साहब थोड़ा time है ना flight के लिए, आप worry मत करो, tension नहीं लेने का, मैं संभालता है. So now, if you know where Bombay Airport is, it's in like Santa Cruz, and when you come near the airport, you find that there's a vast amount of space for the runway and everything, but outside it is habitation. There are people living there. So the
Right.
guy went there, and I don't know what he did. He got one of those like raste ka kuttas, like sheru. So like Sheru, come here. So he put Sheru in and locked that. And then apparently what happened is that this was some like high pedigree, King Charles the 14th Spaniel, or Corgi or whatever. This is some hoity-toity lady. I don't know if she's a Parsi lady or something. Like, at the other end, when the flight landed, she wanted to see her beloved. It had some dog had some Agamemnon, or some fancy name. So when she saw it, she got a cheap shock because you know,
Because
little Agamemnon,
no, I think
bread
this is where
translated into Seru.
because because I think because in India pet ownership it becomes a very political thing because because of the abject poverty,
Right.
if you manage to keep an animal and treat it well, it is seen as
Yeah.
somehow you're kind of pointing resources that could have gone to save a child or another life. So that's a crude comparison, and this is a very filmy thing that how much you spend for your dog you don't spend for your employee and things like that. So
Uh,
there's this kind of politics of that.
I know. But
So
I
this
do know
no no
people who have
but
dogs that travel in AC and only eat ice cream and all. Anyway.
correct, but this guy, the
Yeah.
airport baggage handler, did the wildest thing possible because what he did in one fell swoop He kind of equalized it. He said basically a
Reverse.
dog is a dog. A
Yes.
dog is a dog. If you want to take care of your dog, then
Yeah.
take care of any other dog.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
One is
Yeah.
good as another. So I
Yeah.
think respect to him. I think that's a great story to end on.
Yeah.
I know we've gone stepped away from pigeons, but it's a good place to end with a dog.
Okay. All right, man.
Chalo,
Take care.
just take care.
And yeah, we'll catch up again soon. Bye.
Bye bye.